The first thing that bothered the crew chief was not a gauge. It was a sound. The Huey was already flying. The pilots were doing what pilots did up front, watching the route, the radios, the power, the next place they had to be. The aircraft was still answering them. Nothing had quit. Nothing had lit up in a way that settled the argument for everybody at once. But from the back, where a crew chief spent hour after hour with the engine and transmission noise coming through the airframe, something had changed. Not much, just enough. He listened again. The noise was still there. That was the problem. A helicopter can make a lot of noise and still be perfectly healthy. A Huey was never a quiet workplace. The rotor, the engine, the transmission, the wind through the open cabin, the radios, the guns when they were being used, all of it lived on top of everything else. If you were waiting for silence before you noticed a bad sound, you were going to wait forever. A crew chief learned the opposite way. He learned the normal noise so well that the wrong noise had somewhere to stand out. This crew chief knew this particular aircraft well enough that, during the mission, he wanted out of it. That is how he remembered it later. He kept hearing something from the transmission that he did not like. The Huey kept flying, and now he had a decision to make. Because saying, "Something doesn't sound right," in the back of a helicopter is easy when you are telling the story years later. It is different when the aircraft is still doing its job, when the pilots have a mission in front of them, and when the machine has not given you a clean warning that everybody can point to. You have to decide whether you are hearing a real change or just hearing a Huey being a Huey. You have to decide how certain you need to be before your uncertainty becomes everybody else's problem. And if you are the crew chief, that aircraft is your problem in a way that is hard to explain to somebody who has never done the job. The pilots fly it. You live with it. You see it before the first flight. You see it after the last one. You know where oil likes to show up. You know which panel has been opened. You know what was worked on. You know the normal vibration through the floor, the way the machinery sounds at different power settings, and the little things that never make it into a dramatic story because, most days, nothing comes of them. That familiarity does not make you magical. It makes you responsible. The aircraft in this story was a UH-1H, serial number 6815220. For a time, it was not the crew chief's regular ship. His assigned Huey, number 405, was in the hangar for a tailboom change, so he had been crewing 220 while he waited to get his own aircraft back. That matters because he had not simply walked past 220 once and decided he did not like the sound of it. He had spent time in it. He had learned enough of its normal voice to recognize that something had moved away from normal. He listened during the mission. He kept hearing it. The aircraft still flew. That last fact is what makes the story uncomfortable. A machine that has already failed is easy to take seriously. A machine that might be warning you is harder. There was no moment when every man aboard suddenly turned and said, "Yes, there it is." The crew chief was hearing something that belonged to his part of the work. He was the man in the cabin with the accumulated hours of listening, feeling, cleaning, checking, servicing, writing things up, and learning what that individual aircraft normally did. So he spoke up. Later, he put the memory plainly. He had wanted out of the aircraft during the mission. That is not the same thing as saying he knew what was going to happen. He did not. It is not the same thing as saying he had diagnosed a specific component in flight. He had not. What he had was a change he could hear, a growing lack of trust, and a job that required him to do something with that information. Once the aircraft was back, the problem changed. In the air, The question had been whether the sound was serious enough to interrupt the normal flow of the mission. On the ground, the question became harder in a different way. How do you prove a noise that may not want to perform on command? He reported what he had been hearing to maintenance. Now there were people, procedures, inspections, samples, and the aircraft logbook between a man's ear and the next flight. This is where the story can get misunderstood if we turn it into a simple fight between one sharp crew chief and a bunch of people who did not care. That is not what the record gives us. Army aviation maintenance had layers for a reason. A crew chief could identify a discrepancy. Maintenance personnel could inspect it. Technical inspectors had authority in the process. Test pilots could be involved when work or a suspected problem required the aircraft to be checked in flight. A red X in the logbook meant the aircraft was not considered flyable until the condition was properly cleared. That system existed because one person's impression, even an experienced person's impression, could be right, partly right or wrong. But the opposite was also true. A system can check the things it knows how to check and still be dealing with a problem that appears only under certain conditions. The crew chief remembered getting what he called the usual chip detector explanation. A fluid system sample was sent in. That detail is important. A transmission carries oil. Wear can leave evidence. The system had ways to look for trouble that did not depend on one man saying, "Listen to that." But a clean or inconclusive check does not erase what a man heard. It only changes what can be proved at that moment. And that is where the aircraft began to sit in an awkward place. It had been flying. A crew chief did not trust the noise. Maintenance had a discrepancy to chase. And the problem did not have the courtesy to become simple. If you worked Hueys in Vietnam, this is the part I would like to hear from you about. Not a war story you think people want to hear. The little thing. The sound, vibration, smell, gauge movement, or habit of a particular aircraft that told you something before anybody else saw it. Those are the details that disappear unless the people who remember them write them down. And if this kind of history is why you come here, subscribe. We are going to keep doing it this way. One job, one crew, one problem at a time, with the people who actually had to make the decisions kept in the center of it. For 220, the next useful clue was not a clean answer. It was a vibration. A high-frequency vibration could appear, build, and then become severe. That moved the problem from something one crew chief remembered hearing during a mission to something that could no longer be treated as merely an odd sound in the back of the aircraft. Now, the aircraft had to be tested. And this is the point where the whole story changes direction. Up to here, it has been about whether a crew chief should trust a small difference that only he may have recognized. From here on, the question is what the Army can still do with a helicopter that has an intermittent problem, but has not yet given anybody a neat, repeatable failure on the ground. You cannot repair sometimes. You cannot replace maybe. You have to isolate a system, reproduce a condition, find evidence, inspect a component, or fly the aircraft under controlled conditions until the problem shows enough of itself to be identified. That is why maintenance test flying existed. On January 3, 1970, Warrant Officer Richard Derosier accepted 68 to 15220 for a maintenance test flight at Vinh Long. Captain Stewart Moody went with him as the technical observer. The formal accident record says the aircraft was being test flown after replacement of an elevator horn assembly. A later account connected the flight with the effort to identify the high-frequency vibration. Those two pieces of the record do not line up perfectly, and they should not be forced into a cleaner story than the evidence gives us. What we do know is that 220 was not simply heading out on another ordinary lift mission that afternoon. It was being checked. At about 3:30, Derosier pre-flighted and accepted the Huey. He called the tower for a maintenance hover check, then went for fuel. At 3:43, he called for departure and told Vinh Long Tower he would remain south of the airfield for the test. That is a very different kind of flight from the one the crew chief had been on when he heard the transmission noise. There were no troops waiting in the back. No landing zone had to be reached. No cargo had to be delivered. The mission now was the aircraft itself. And that sounds safer, because the crew could concentrate on the machine. In one sense, it was. In another, it meant the crew had to take the problem back into the one place where an intermittent flight problem might finally show itself: the air. That is the trap in a story like this. People sometimes talk about maintenance as if the safe choice is always obvious. If something seems wrong, ground it, fix it, then fly it. Of course. But what if it is grounded and the problem cannot be confirmed? What exactly are you fixing? You can inspect. You can sample. You can change a suspected part. You can run the aircraft. You can hover it. But some faults only appear with aerodynamic load, vibration, power changes, control inputs, temperature, or combinations that are difficult to reproduce sitting on the ground. At some point, somebody has to decide whether the evidence supports another flight. And if it does, that flight becomes part of the diagnosis. That was the work Derosier and Moody were doing. For the crew chief, who had previously heard the wrong sound, his part had already happened. He had noticed it. He had reported it. He had written the aircraft up. But that does not mean his responsibility felt finished. Years later, it plainly did not. That is one reason his recollection matters so much. He was not telling a story about how smart he had been. He was telling a story about not being sure he had pushed hard enough. There is a difference. He remembered telling maintenance what he kept hearing. He remembered wanting out during the mission. He remembered marking the aircraft down for the transmission noise. And then, other people had to carry the problem forward. That is how aviation works when it works properly. Responsibility moves. The crew chief hears something. Maintenance checks it. A technical inspector may have to sign off work. A test pilot takes the aircraft and tries to determine whether it is ready to return to service. Nobody owns the whole chain alone, but each man owns his piece of it while it is in his hands. At about 4 o'clock that afternoon, something changed in flight. The tower received a partial radio transmission from 220. It lasted only a little more than 10 seconds. Most of it was noise. The accident investigation later described rotor sounds slowing during that transmission, with a wind-like whistle appearing and fading. Then, the transmission ended. Witnesses on the ground did not all agree on every detail of what they saw. That is normal in a sudden aircraft accident, especially when people are seeing it from different positions and distances. The investigating officer had to compare those accounts and reconstruct the sequence. What mattered was that 220 entered a violent loss of control in the air. The main rotor system separated from the aircraft before it reached the ground. Derosier and Moody were killed. There is no reason to decorate that sentence. 2 men had gone up to test a helicopter with an unresolved history, and they did not come back. The accident record became part of the Army's attempt to understand what happened mechanically. The later recollections became something else. They became the human record of what people had noticed before the final flight. One account suggested a hydraulic hardover condition as the possible cause during an effort to stimulate the high-frequency vibration. That remained an interpretation, not something we should turn into certainty decades later. The crew chief's memory was simpler. He had heard transmission noise in that aircraft before the accident. He had not liked it. He had wanted out of it. And when he learned what happened, he began asking himself a question that never really left him. Should he have been more insistent? That question is harder than the mechanical one. The mechanical investigation can look at parts, positions, damage, maintenance history, components, control systems, and known failure modes. The human question has no gauge. How hard do you push when you know something feels wrong, but cannot prove exactly why? At what point does experience outrank the absence of a warning light? At what point does refusing to accept "we didn't find anything" become good judgment rather than stubbornness? There is no clean answer because the men involved did not have the ending when they were making those decisions. We do. That changes everything. Once you know 220 was lost on the test flight, the earlier transmission noise sounds enormous. It was not enormous when the crew chief first heard it. That is the whole point. It was one wrong sound inside an aircraft full of sound. That is what makes expertise so difficult to see from the outside. The dramatic part is often not what the expert sees. It is the difference between what he expects and what he gets. A crew chief did not need the Huey to become quiet before he could hear trouble. He needed it to stop sounding like itself. And that kind of knowledge was built in hours nobody counted as a story. Pre-flight, post-flight, cleaning, servicing, looking for leaks, watching panels come off, watching them go back on, hearing the aircraft start cold, hearing it after a long day, feeling the floor with different loads aboard, listening when the pilots pulled power, listening again when they backed out of it. You could hand two men the same maintenance manual. It did not mean they had heard the same aircraft for the same number of hours. That does not make instinct better than procedure. It means instinct and procedure were supposed to meet each other. The crew chief's ear created a discrepancy. The maintenance system had to turn that discrepancy into something it could inspect, repair, clear, or continue investigating. And somewhere in that handoff lived the risk. Not because anybody necessarily ignored a known broken part, because the problem was not yet kind enough to become a known broken part. That distinction matters. It protects this story from becoming a cheap lesson about somebody not listening. The record does not support that. It supports something more useful and, I think, more familiar to anybody who ever worked around machinery for a living. Sometimes the first sign of a problem arrives in a form that is real enough to bother the person closest to the machine, but not yet specific enough to tell everybody else what to replace. Then, the clock starts. You can keep checking. You can take it out of service. You can run it on the ground. You can change something that looks suspicious. You can test it. Every step removes one uncertainty and may create another. That is what happened with 220. The crew chief's uncertainty became a maintenance problem. The maintenance problem became a test flight problem. And the test flight ended the chance to ask the aircraft another question. The man who had heard the sound carried his own version of the accident long after the paperwork was done. He said he felt as though he had failed by not being more insistent. I do not think the historical record gives us the right to agree with him, and it does not give us the right to tell him he was wrong to feel it. That belongs to him. What we can say is that he did notice something. He did report it. He did mark the aircraft down because of it. And he remembered the sound decades later, because after January 3, 1970, it was no longer just a strange noise in somebody else's Huey. It became the last warning he could remember hearing before two other men took that aircraft up to find the problem. There is another detail here that people who worked aviation may understand better than the rest of us. The Huey was a machine the Army needed constantly. Vietnam put enormous demand on helicopters, crews, mechanics, parts, and maintenance organizations. Aircraft accumulated hours. Components wore. Ships were repaired and returned. Skilled crew chiefs and mechanics were valuable because keeping helicopters available was not an administrative exercise. Units needed them to move people, ammunition, food, water, mail, wounded men, commanders, reconnaissance teams, and everything else that had to cross terrain faster than the ground allowed. That operational pressure is real background, but it should not be used as an excuse for what happened to 220. The evidence does not let us say the aircraft was pushed into the air simply because somebody wanted another Huey on the schedule. What it does explain is why maintenance judgment mattered so much. A helicopter sitting on the ground could not do the mission. A helicopter returned to service with an unresolved fault could create a worse problem. The men in maintenance lived between those two facts every day, and the crew chief lived even closer to them because he went with the aircraft. He was not a mechanic handing over a machine and watching it leave from the shop floor. He climbed aboard. That changes the meaning of "I wanted out of it." He was not making a theoretical complaint about a noise somebody else would have to live with. He was in the Huey while it was flying. He knew what normal sounded like from the place where he worked. And at some point during that mission, normal was gone. If you have ever worked around engines, trucks, farm equipment, factory machinery, boats, airplanes, anything you knew well enough to hear without thinking about it, you may know exactly what I mean. Somebody new hears noise. You hear a change. You may not have the name for it yet. You may not be able to point to the part. But you know the machine has started saying something it did not say yesterday. That is not superstition. It is pattern recognition built out of repetition. And repetition was one thing Vietnam gave a Huey crew chief in abundance. Flights ran into flights. Maintenance ran into more maintenance. A young enlisted man could spend more time around one helicopter than most people spend around any machine they will ever own. The aircraft became familiar in small ways. That is why I would not tell this story from the pilot's seat. The pilots matter. Derosier and Moody matter. The maintenance people matter. But the thing that makes 220 stay with you begins farther back in the cabin, with a man hearing something that had not yet become an emergency. The helicopter did not drop out of the sky at that moment. It kept flying. The mission did not instantly stop in a cloud of smoke. The machine kept answering the controls. And the crew chief was left with the hardest kind of warning, one that gives you time to doubt yourself. He did not ignore it. He wrote it up. That point deserves to stay clear. The later accident does not turn him into a prophet. It does not prove that the exact noise he heard was the exact mechanical chain that caused the loss of 220. The surviving record is not clean enough for that claim, but it proves something narrower. Before that Huey's final flight, a crew chief who had spent time in it believed its transmission did not sound right, believed the concern was serious enough to mark the aircraft non-flyable, and remembered wanting out of it while it was still in the air. That is enough. Because the value of the story is not that a man predicted an accident. The value is that he recognized a change before the machine gave him certainty. That is the part of aviation history that disappears when we tell everything from accident reports and cockpit positions. A crew chief's work was full of things too small for the official story until one of them turned out not to be small. A loose feeling, A new vibration. A smell that had no business being there. A stain where yesterday there was dry metal. Or one wrong sound buried inside the loudest workplace most young men had ever known. For 68 to 15220, the formal record ended in a rice field south of Vinh Long on January 3, 1970. The crew chief's record ended somewhere else. It stayed in his head. Years later, when he saw the accident discussed again, he went straight back to the transmission noise and to the fact that he had known that aircraft well enough to distrust what he was hearing. He wished he had said more. That may be the most human line in the whole file. Not because we know saying more would have changed the outcome. We do not. But because anyone who has ever been responsible for a machine, a crew, or another person's safety knows what happens after the fact. You replay the point where uncertainty was still uncertainty. You remember what you noticed. You remember what you said. And you wonder whether you should have made them stop and listen one more time. The Huey kept flying when he first heard it. That was exactly why the sound mattered.